Welcome to the conversation. I'm Mark Thompson, always excited to be here on TYT and really excited to talk to our first guest. Sairu Jairaman is someone who has done such great work in the world of wages as they relate to restaurant work, as they relate to so many workers that toil in America in ways that are unimaginable. And I say that word, it sounds like an exaggeration, but it's not really. She is president of One Fair Wage. When I talk about unimaginable wages, oftentimes the way that restaurant workers particularly are jobbed out of benefits and jobbed out of even unemployment benefits when they lose their jobs is something that many of us as Americans are unaware of. Anyway, Sairu, without any further delay, welcome to TYT and the conversation.
Thanks for having me.
I really shortened your intro. I mean, you're an amazing person with graduating Yale Law and Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and you were on CNN's top 10 visionary women list. You edged me out of that list. I was really hoping to make that. So, but you authored Behind the Kitchen Door, and I mean, you're an author, and you're, I think, a frequent visitor to CNN and MSNBC and HBO, et cetera. So now I feel like I've given you a more thorough intro, but I really want to get back to the centerpiece issue, particularly during the pandemic. I feel this is so critical. Tell us about the restaurant environment and how it exploits these workers. I mean, even in the best of times, but how these workers, I think, are subjected to some extraordinary circumstances now.
Yeah, so prior to the pandemic, we would talk about the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, which is really the source of a lot of the atrocities that you're talking about as an issue of racial, economic, and gender injustice. For those people who do not know, the restaurant industry is the second largest and absolute fastest growing sector of the US economy, but also the absolute lowest paying. And that's largely due to the money, power, and influence of a trade lobby called the National Restaurant Association, which we call the other NRA. It represents the chains, the IHOPs, the Applebee's. And it turns out that it's been around, the other NRA, since emancipation of slavery, when it first demanded the right to hire newly freed slaves, not pay them anything at all, and have them live entirely on tips, which was a mutation of the original concept of tipping. Tipping was always an extra or bonus on top of a wage, but with emancipation and the industry's desire to hire Black people and not pay them anything, it was mutated into a replacement for wages rather than an extra or bonus. And so we started with a $0 wage for tipped workers at emancipation, and we went all the way up to $2.13 an hour, the current federal minimum wage for tipped workers in 2020. Today, 43 states, including very blue states, Massachusetts, New York, Illinois, DC, have sub-minimum wages for tipped workers. And today, 70% of tipped workers are women. They are largely women, disproportionately women of color who work in casual restaurants, IHOPs, Applebee's, Olive Gardens. They struggled before the pandemic with the highest rates of economic instability and sexual harassment of any industry, because they had to put up with all kinds of inappropriate customer behavior to feed their families in tips. And in fact, the 7 states that got rid of this system many decades ago, California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska, the data showed they were doing really well. Their industries were booming, tips were high, wages were high, job growth was high, higher than the 43 states with a sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. But those 7 states had 1/2 the rate of sexual harassment in the industry, because in those states, they got a full minimum wage. They weren't as reliant on the tips to feed their families. All of that was pre-pandemic. With the pandemic, this became an issue of life and death, because as you mentioned, 60% of workers in this industry, and this is a huge industry, 13.6 million workers, 60% could not get unemployment insurance because of the sub-minimum wage. In most states, they were told that their wages were too low to qualify for benefits. And then when they went back to work, after months of not having any source of income, they were desperate. Summer and fall, workers went back for outdoor dining and then indoor dining. And what they reported in this report that we just came out with is that they were largely unable to get tips. 80% of workers said their tips were way down. And then that there were no safety protocols in place. And that unfortunately, they were subjected to extremely high rates of hostility, aggression, and worst of all, sexual harassment. much higher than pre-pandemic levels. 40% of workers said sexual harassment went way up. And in particular, hundreds of women submitted comments from male customers along the lines of, take your mask off so I can see what you look like and judge your tips on that basis, which is a horrific and outrageous comment made by so many men. We've heard it now from so many men that we're calling it masculine harassment. We've heard it from so many women that these are the comments that they're getting from men.
I almost don't know where to start with this, but I want to start a little further back because people might say, well, restaurant workers get less money because they get all that tip money. Now, you've just reviewed the fact, and we're going to get to that in a second, that obviously post or with the COVID-19 situation, these tips are way down for a lot of reasons. And as I say, we'll get to it in a second. But can you just address that argument? Look, you're getting your tip money. That's making up for the shortfall with your minimum wage.
Yeah. First of all, even with tips, it's so important to understand that these workers pre-pandemic had a median wage nationally of about $9 an hour, including tips, because the vast majority of tipped workers don't work in fancy fine dining restaurants. They work in Applebee's and IHOPs and small mom and pop diners across America. And they were struggling to make ends meet. Look, they used food stamps at double the rate of the rest of the US workforce. And I always say, no matter what you want to say about how much these workers make in tips, applying for food stamps is a difficult and stigmatized process. So a majority female workforce that's disproportionately women of color and disproportionately single mothers is not going to go apply for food stamps for fun. They were clearly struggling before the pandemic. And even if you believe that's not true and they were rolling in tips, the fact that this industry had the highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry, 90% of workers reported regularly experiencing sexual harassment, can be traced directly back to the fact that they were not paid by their boss, that they were totally dependent on the whims and biases of customers. So, I think people like to think of themselves as good tippers, and therefore they like to think that tipped workers make a lot of money in tips. But the truth is, across the country, nationally, these workers were struggling mightily before the pandemic because they mostly didn't work in places where they got very much in tips. Because tips are volatile, even in high-end restaurants, they change season to season, month to month, week to week. Look, your bills don't go up and down every month, but your tips do. And because a mostly female workforce was subjected to sexual harassment because they were living off tips. All of that was pre-pandemic. With the pandemic, the power dynamic that's at the root of the problem, the power dynamic between male customers and women servers, that was really the root of the problem of the sexual harassment pre-pandemic, has been so grossly exacerbated because now not only do these women have far fewer customers, they're totally dependent on whatever customer walks in the door, but they're also reporting that there's been a change in clientele. The customers that are worried about COVID and very strict about, masks and social distancing are not coming to restaurants because they're more scared. Maybe they go occasionally. The people who are regularly eating out right now and regularly going to bars are the ones who don't care as much, are not as worried about wearing masks and social distancing, and frankly are more aggressive when it comes to being told you have to do this, you have to sit apart, you have to wear a mask. And so these women, the power dynamic has changed so dramatically, both because there are far fewer customers and because the kinds of customers they're getting are so much more aggressive.
Yeah, I don't envy any restaurant worker who has to say to any customer to whom they're beholden if they want to get any kind of additional compensation on top of the check. I don't envy them the need to say, hey, sir, would you mind moving over a little bit more? My manager, however you couch it, my manager will fire me if I don't ask you to at least, whatever the deal is. Wow, and I know your work, and I know you've done a lot of work with those who are behind the servers, that is to say the kitchen workers and all the abuse and, if you will, the destitute oftentimes conditions from which those workers come. So maybe that for our next conversation, but just to round this off, The other thing that's happening is that these jobs that you're talking about, as awful as they are, I mean, given all of these other externals that you've mentioned, they're hard to come by now because many restaurants are closing, and then maybe even many more will close with this coming holiday spike in COVID-19 numbers.
They are, and what we desperately need is for Congress to get its act together and provide some relief to these workers in the form of ongoing stimulus, unemployment insurance, a social safety net that doesn't exist right now in this country. But I also believe that this industry is resilient. Restaurants are going to reopen after the pandemic. And the real question is, can we reimagine a different industry that's more sustainable, that's more equitable? We can, because 7 states have done it. We need to pass the Raise the Wage Act, a full minimum wage for workers with tips on top. Governor Cuomo has said he would do this in New York. He hasn't done it. Let's move to a better system through this pandemic so we come out stronger.
We'll look for more from you, and I look forward to your next visit to the conversation as well, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.